What are some miraculous milestones in human history? Occupying Till He Comes at Southwest Prophecy Ministries. Welcome, friends. This is David Schnitker, your host for today's program. Thank you for joining us. Just a reminder that these programs are supported by your gifts to this ministry. If you would like to contribute to this ongoing faith ministry, which deals with Bible prophecy and current events, simply go to our website to contribute. Our website address is www.swpm.us. You will find a donate link on the homepage. The website address again is www.swpm.us. Thank you for your prayers and support for this faith ministry. It is a great honor to have Bill Federer in studio today. Bill is a well-known author and conference speaker. He is a respected historian and current events expert. We have some of his books with us today. He's written 25 at last count. And here are a couple of books that I just picked up yesterday, and I just can't wait to get into them. This is a two-part series here. This one is called Change to Chains, the 6,000-Year Quest for Control, Volume 1, Rise of the Republic. And here we have Volume 2 of the same series called Rise of the Tyrant. And these, I'm sure, are very great historical books, as well as books that will help us to get a good understanding as to what is happening in our world today. But today we're actually going to be talking about his latest book that I just happen to have with me as well, Miraculous Milestones in Science, Medicine, and Innovation, and the Faith of Those Who Achieved Them. I have been making my way through the book, just purchased it yesterday, but it is fascinating, and we're going to be talking about this book today. And so, Bill, welcome to our show.
Well, David, it's great to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you here in Oklahoma. I know you've been had a whirlwind schedule, speaking in 27 locations in 10 days. That's got to be some kind of a record. But yet you're still here, still smiling, and still have your voice. So it's great to have you. So in today's program, we are going to be talking about your latest book. And then at the end of the program, we'll tell our listeners what they can look forward to next week's program. But the first question is, why did you decide to write this book? You're a busy man, you travel and you speak here and there, and this book is a little bit different than some of your other books because it deals with science and inventions and medicine, etc. So why did you decide to write this book?
Cancel culture. So students are on campus, and if they believe in God, they're marginalized. They're considered unintellectual. They could be graded lower on their tests. And we see an anti-Christian sentiment sweeping across the schools and across the campuses. And then also professors. Here you have where if a professor acknowledges they believe in intelligent design, that, gee, it wasn't all some random chance, that professor could lose their job. They could be blackballed. They could have their articles dropped from being carried in professional magazines. And so what this book is acknowledgments of great scientists in the past and their acknowledgments of faith. Some of them were Christian, some of them just believed in a creator, but nevertheless they all believed that there was a God that caused all of this to come together. And it starts off with the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution more or less officially kicks off with Nicholas Copernicus, and he's the one who discovered the heliocentric solar system. So instead of the Earth being the center, which the ancient astronomer Ptolemy thought, now it's the sun is the center. So helio means sun. And Copernicus believed in God. He was and he wrote about there being two books. One is the book of nature, that God reveals his power, his creative ability, his glory, his infinite intelligence. But the other is the book of scriptures, the Bible.
Okay.
And that's where God reveals his plan of redemption.
Reminds me of Romans chapter 1, where, of course, Paul talks about the creation, the divine order is a testimony to humanity so that mankind is without excuse. So two volumes in, you might say, Revelation. One is biblical revelation, the other is natural revelation. So he espoused both volumes.
Yeah, and so I worked my way through the astronomers. And so after Copernicus, you have Galileo, right? He's the first astronomer to use a telescope. And he would make the telescopes himself and sell them and so forth. But here's a quote from Galileo: "Mathematics is the language in which God has written the universe." Right? And they would notice that the planets would follow orders. And he said, "I give infinite thanks to God who has been pleased to make me the first observer of marvelous things." Right? Because he's the first one to have a telescope and would notice things. Another astronomer is Tycho Brahe. He's in Denmark. And he catalogs celestial observations. So what's that? Well, he keeps a very detailed log of which planets are in which places at which time. Why is this important? And by the way, Tycho Brahe gave a great quote. He said, "Those who study the stars have God for a teacher." So his assistant was Johannes Kepler. And he took those catalogs of astronomical observations and he began to notice the patterns. And lo and behold, Kepler comes up with the laws of planetary motion. And he noticed that there were 8 planets, and then there were 8 notes on the piano, right, in music. And so he called it an octave. And he said the same way that music has 8 notes and they are in harmony, then the 8 planets and their orbits, they're in harmony. And so he wrote a book called Harmonies of the World. And in that book he said, "O Almighty God, I am thinking thy thoughts after thee." One of his quotes, he talked about how God created the world, and he said God had to wait thousands of years for an observer, the same way that I may have to wait hundreds of years for a reader. So I wrote this book. Who knows who's going to read it? And then you have Sir Isaac Newton, and he is one that discovered the laws of gravity, and he was 1666, Great Plague of London, a quarter of the city dies. And so he has to leave, going to college, right? I think it was Cambridge, and he went to his farm, or his family estate. And while he's meditating in his early 20s, he sees an apple fall. And he begins to think, okay, what caused that apple to fall down and not sideways? And if there's a pull toward the earth, does that pull end at the tree? Maybe it goes all the way up to the moon, and the earth is pulling the moon and keeping it in orbit. And maybe it goes all the way to the sun, and it's the pull of the sun that keeps and he begins to develop the laws of gravity. And then he has the laws of motion and the laws of optics, right? So you have light, but it's made up of the waves in a prism, and you see the colors of the rainbow. And did you know that Isaac Newton wrote more on the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation and the prophecies of Jesus returning than he wrote on science? Here's this great scientist, Isaac Newton, and he was just consumed with trying to understand Bible prophecy. And
so he was a great theologian as well as a great scientist.
Yeah, and many of them actually studied in theological schools. And so you had to take vows at a certain level where you were going to be a priest in order to continue your education. Then they finally tweaked it and said, well, you could be a lawyer or you could be something else. And so that's when he became a scientist. But here's a quote from Isaac Newton. He says, "This most wonderful system of sun, planet, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. Order in life in the universe could happen only by the willful reasoning of its original creator, whom I call the Lord God." So you got Isaac Newton, and here he is believing in scriptures. That's just one of the people that I talk about in the book. But I go through later astronomers, and there's even a black astronomer, Benjamin Benneker. He's a Quaker. He's a free black. He's in Maryland. A neighbor is an astronomer and teaches him all about how to do it. And he becomes so good at it, he begins to catalog Ephemeris tables. And what's that? That's where you keep track of the stars and where the seasons change and the tides go, and you keep records of the past. So when the moon is, a full moon, then you'll have a high tide, all that stuff. And that's written down into an almanac. Right? You got Ben Franklin had a Poor Richard's Almanac, but he had a Benjamin Banneker's Almanac. And so it was sort of like an early forecasting. The farmers would know when's spring going to start this year. And so, okay, here's a guy, he looked at the stars, and the seasons are going to change on this date, and in the past, on this date, the weather's such and such, so probably this will be, and so, anyways, black astronomer. And Benjamin Banneker, he's one of the chapters in the book. He helped survey Washington, D.C., and he corresponded with Thomas Jefferson. But even you have Edwin Hubble with the Hubble telescope.
Oh, yes.
And so he had the biggest telescope of the era, and it was in Pasadena, California. And he looked at the stars, and he saw this fuzzy star. And he began to zoom in on it and begin to see, what, that's not a fuzzy star. That's an entire other galaxy.
Wow.
It was the Andromeda Galaxy.
Wow.
And that this just blew the minds of everybody that was into astronomy, that, it's not they thought the galaxy and the universe were synonymous. Now they realize there's lots of galaxies.
Other galaxies. Wow.
And he made another contribution, and that is light is waves, and the different colors travel at different speeds. So blue is the fastest wave, and red's the slowest wave. And so as the galaxies were further and further away, they would take on a reddish hue, which means you're seeing the slow wave, which means it's going in the other direction, which means that if it's going somewhere, that it had to come from somewhere. And so Edwin Hubble invited Albert Einstein out to California to view the telescope. Einstein thought that the universe was static. Everything's there, everything's been there, everything will be there, nothing changes, and we just got these laws that control it all. And when Einstein looked through the telescope of Edwin Hubble and saw the red shift, he said, "This shows the necessity of there being a beginning." And so this, again, revolutionized his whole, and this was the theory of the Big Bang. And now, I'm not a scientist. I love reading it. But they have the photon accelerators, right? These colliders. And you think, what is that? They got one in Switzerland. They go, and it's miles and miles in a circle. And they have these lights, these laser lights, and they have the light travel. And then they have these beams of light hit each other. Now, light is made up of photons. And when they hit each other at these immense fast speeds, somehow or another, they're able to photograph it or whatever, and they see these things that fly off that they have identified as positrons and electrons. And you think, what's the big deal with that? Well, a positron and an electron are some of the basic elements of matter. Lo and behold, photons of light can turn into matter. And so now we have a whole new insight into the Bible scripture that says, in the beginning, God said, let there be light. So lo and behold, light happened. And so these physicists are saying, okay, well, the energy, so Einstein's theory of E equals mc squared, energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. So if you can get mass going, fast enough, it turns into light. Well, the contrary is true. If you take the energy of the light, then it can turn into mass. And so, but anyway, it sort of lines up with the Bible. You can let there be light, and then after that is the creation of the matter.
So it's kind of enlightening the process, perhaps, by which God created matter.
Yeah. And so then there's Vernon von Braun. And so he's the father of modern space flight.
Yes.
And he was a strong believer in his later career. And so I tell his whole life story of him being in Germany and so forth. But he was, in one of his writings, he said when the Apollo 8 circled the moon, and you had the Frank Borman, the astronaut, and he read from the book of Genesis on Christmas Eve, 1968. In the beginning God created the heaven, and he read that. And and they even had a U.S. stamp in the beginning, God. But he gets back down to earth. And then they are interviewing Frank Borman. And they said, you know, a Russian cosmonaut went up in space, and he said he did not see God. And Frank Borman said, I didn't see him either, but I saw his evidence. And so that's what this book is. This is evidence, right? There's always going to be the step of faith. So it's like two nodes in electricity, positive, and they make an arc, you know? They'll never touch. So God will never make it totally convincing, because then it won't take any faith.
Right.
And without faith, it's impossible. So he has the evidence is there, but it's always going to take that. But this book is showing this evidence that here you have great scientists, and they believed in a creator.
Let me ask this, because I haven't finished reading that, but the early chapters do establish that these early astronomers and Kepler and these others who just really changed our understanding of reality were all men of faith. They might not have all been Baptists. I'm not saying that they subscribed to a particular doctrinal position in all of its complexity, but were there, as you did the research on this, were there scientists, explorers that their understanding of the Scripture may have led them towards certain conclusions? In other words, did the Bible inform some of them kind of in a how should we say, a presuppositional manner, so that they had a view that the world or the universe was a certain way?
Yeah, many scientists did get inspiration. There's Matthew Fontaine Maury, who's considered the father of studying sea currents. But he said he read in the scriptures where it says the paths of the sea. Paths of the sea. And so that he began to study, but it inspired him. Another is writing. And so I go all the way back to the beginning of the invention of writing, Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets in the Mesopotamian Valley. And it was only for kings. It was to keep record of court records of how, have you ever tallied where you draw the lines 1, 2, 3, 4, and then a line across for 5? Writing started as an accounting method for kings to have their scribes to keep track of everything they own. And there were 1,500 Sumerian cuneiforms. That's a lot to memorize. And then in Egypt, they had 3,000 hieroglyphs, only for the pharaohs and court records. Matter of fact, the scribes kept them complicated on purpose as job security. So people couldn't read it. Common people,
they couldn't pass it on to a successor, huh?
Yeah, they were needed as a class to decipher these complicated. What does this say? I don't know. Let's call the scribe. Oh yes, that means this. And so, why is this important? When Moses comes down the mountain, he does not just have the law. He has the law in a 22-character alphabet. First letter's Aleph, second letter's Beth. So easy to learn, kids could learn it. So no longer is reading and writing in 1,500 cuneiform or 3,000 hieroglyphs, and only the upper class, deep state ruling class could read. Now everybody could read.
22 simple characters.
And so Israel was the first instance of a literate population. And so the Israelites settled where? In the Canaan land. Well, what's next to Canaan? Well, where the tribe of Dan moved up to where? Right by Tyre and Sidon and Lebanon. And they were called Phoenicians. And so there is one line of theory that the Phoenicians, the phonetic language, may have been inspired by the Hebrew language rather than the other way around. And then the Phoenicians sailed, and there's even a verse in the book of Judges where they have the story of Deborah. And she says, and Dan didn't come and help us because they were in their ships. And Asher, which was the tribe next to Dan, they were busy in their seaports. So now we have two tribes, and they're associated with sea travel. Well, the Phoenicians were associated with sea travel. And anyway, so the Phoenician language turned into the Greek language alphabet, turned into the Roman alphabet, turned into what we have today. So there is a line of thinking that, maybe our very writing, and then I go through the history of printing and the Chinese and then Gutenberg and the printing press, and the Bible is the #1 best-selling book of all times. I go through the history of the calendar. Right, so we're recording this in 2021, and that's what? 2021 years from what? From the birth of Jesus.
Birth of Christ, yeah.
So they used to date things according to the reigns of kings. So in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, 6th year of reign of King Hezekiah. And so in the year 1526, they were still dating stuff according to the reign of Diocletian. It was Anno Diocletiani. And so Justinian the Roman Empire becomes Christian with Constantine in 320, 313, but now we're up to 525. The emperor is a Christian emperor, Justinian, and there's a monk named Dionysius Exiguus, and he's like dating everything based on Anno Diocletiani. It's like, why are we dating things to this Roman emperor's reign when he persecuted Christians? And so Dionysius Exiguus dates all the way back, the best he can figure, to the birth of Jesus. And then he writes in the margin, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord's reign. And then when the Dark Ages came, only the monks could read, and so they began to use this. And then when the colonial period happened, you had these countries, Portugal, Spain, Holland, England, spreading colonies around the world. They took that dating system with them, and now the whole world uses it. So the whole world uses a dating system which goes all the way back to the birth of Jesus.
Wow. So it separates history. Basically, the birth of Christ is the center point of history, even in our calendar system that's used throughout the world.
Yeah, and then I'll go through how Easter impacted our calendar. And I don't have time to get into all that, but you had, Julius Caesar came up with the Julian calendar instead of dating based on the moon, based on the sun, and then he shifted the months from the beginning of the year being the spring equinox in March 20th to January 1st. And we know there's a remnant of that because the name of the month September, sept is Latin for 7. But it's our 9th month. And octagon, that's the number for 8. It's our 10th month. And nova is Latin for 9, and decimal, like December, is Latin for 10. How come it's the 12th? Well, Julius Caesar moved the beginning of the month from March to January 1st.
Oh, okay.
And so it's called a Julian year. And so he wanted this common calendar to unify the Roman Empire, but now you got Constantine becoming a Christian Roman emperor, and he wants to have a Christian day, so he makes it be Easter, but he wants it on a Sunday, which means instead of asking the Jews when Passover is, they have to come up with a new formula. It's a little bit complicated, but it's the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox, and they make these tables listing all the dates into the future, and but they don't realize the Julian calendar is off 11 minutes per year. And so by the time you get to the 1500s, it's 10 days off. So then you get a Pope Gregory that erases 10 days and comes up with a Gregorian calendar. And he comes up with the formula to skip a leap year every 400 years. So it's the calendar we use today. It's the Gregorian calendar. And but it's all based on trying to stick with the date of Easter.
Right.
And so
which Constantine established as a Sunday, as opposed to pegging it to the Hebrew.
Yeah. So you look back
Passover.
and you're like, did he really have to do that? Couldn't he just left it with the Passover because that's what it was supposed to be for, And but I get into it. It's Christian history, but it affected something that we're taking so common today as our calendar.
Right.
And I go through all kinds of other inventions. One of them is the invention of hospitals. And I don't know if I have time to mention that.
Sure, we'll mention that.
So right now, today, we have them wanting to force medical professionals, if you're a Christian, to give up your Christian faith. And if they tell you to do an abortion, do it. If they tell you to do a transgender surgery, you do it. You just got to give. But wait a second. Hospitals were started by Christians. And you say, really? Yeah. The Egyptians, Chinese, Greeks, they didn't have hospital care for the poor. So we talked about Constantine, and we talked about people going on pilgrimages to the Holy Land. And so at the Council of Nicaea, they decided that every place where there's a cathedral where people are making a pilgrimage to, there should be an infirmary. Because they're traveling miles and they get there worn out. So these infirmaries, the word for traveler in Latin is hosp, H-O-S-P, where we get the word hospitality to greet. And so a hospital was a place where the travelers came because they're going on pilgrimage to a Christian site. And then you had the Justinian, and there's a plague that sweeps through and it kills millions of people. And so there's a Saint Samson the Hospitable in Constantinople, and he doctors people, and the Justinian gives him money and he starts a hospital. And then you have the Benedictine Order, which has lots of monasteries. They put an infirmary in each monastery, and Benedictine Order starts the first medical school in Salerno, Italy.
So they're associated with churches and monasteries, hospitals and medical schools.
Yeah, and so then the Benedictines start a hospital in Paris called the Hotel Dieu, and hotel comes from the word hosp or traveler, but it's the Hotel of Dieu, means God. And then you have the bubonic plague, comes from China. Could you imagine an illness coming from China?
I can't imagine.
And it comes across the China Silk Road with the caravans in little fleas. And then they get to the Middle East and they get on rats and they get on ships and they land in Constantinople around 1347 and millions of people die. And ships go from there all to England, to France, all around, and 75 million people die.
Wow.
And nobody wants to bury the dead bodies. And so there's an order of Christian men called the Election Brothers, after a Saint Alexis who gave away his money to take care of the poor. And so these men collect the dead bodies and give them a Christian burial. And then if they're not dead yet, they have some hospice care and help lead them to the Lord as best they can. And then you had, in around 1600, a guy named Vincent de Paul. And he is captured by the Muslims, and he's made a slave. And he begins to witness to one of his master's wives, and she ends up believing. And she witnesses to the master, and he ends up sort of believing. And they allow Vincent de Paul to escape, goes back to Europe, and he starts a hospital. The Queen of France helps fund it and so forth. And so then there's this order of the Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul, and they run the hospital in Paris, and they start hundreds of hospitals across Europe. And then when the French Revolution happens, they wouldn't give up their faith and embrace the secular government. So the secular French government decided to chop off the nuns' heads. They would whole orders of nuns. They call them, these sisters, and they would be singing their church song as they would be marched up to the guillotine. And there'd be one less person singing, one less person singing. Finally, the last one gets their head chopped off. No more singing.
Wow!
Sort of like today, where you have the government forcing these little sisters of the poor to fund Obamacare and support abortions.
Right.
And they got to fight all the way to the Supreme Court.
Yep.
Ben Franklin starts the first hospital in America, 1755. It's dedicated to Christ. And then you have others start hospitals, but it was these sisters that come over and start a hospital in St. Louis, Missouri, and it's the first hospital west of the Mississippi. Lincoln had them following the soldiers around during the Civil War and taking care of the sick, sort of like Clara Barton, a school teacher, taking care of the poor. And anyway, the Florence Nightingale, who was an English woman who took care of the soldiers in the Crimea War in 1856, in between Russia and the Turks and over there, she said there's no better training for nursing than a Catholic nun.
Wow.
So they were just sort of known for this. And the nurse's hat came from the nun's habit. So the nuns would wear the little, and so the nurses would have that little hat on there. That came from, and so 8 of the 10 largest hospital corporations in America were started by these different Catholic orders. And then you had them started by the Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians and Luthers and Seventh-day Adventists and all these other different groups. But the point I'm making, it was Christians motivated to do unto the least of these as you've done unto Jesus, Christians motivated to take care of the poor that started hospitals.
Wow.
And here they're wanting to pressure these Christians, say, oh, this is medical, you got to get your faith out.
Right.
When we tell you to do abortions, or we tell you to do transgender surgeries, or we tell you to do euthanasia, you've just got to give up any Christian motivation and values you have and just obey this new government-controlled healthcare system.
So it's an attempt to hijack, basically, the Christian heritage in our healthcare and hospitals and hospices that really come out of the Christian faith and turn them for secular or ungodly purposes. That's what we're facing today.
Yeah, it's and even the same with prisons, right? You had Quakers, nonviolent, William Penn, they found Pennsylvania, and they didn't like the corporal punishment of whipping people or putting them in stocks. And so Ben Franklin came up with the idea, put somebody in a room with a Bible and leave them in there till they become penitent. And so they called the place a penitentiary for penitents.
How about that?
And it began to spread this nonviolent way of, and so now you have, Bible chaplains going into prisons. It's like, oh, should they be in there? It's like, wait a second, they're the ones that came up with the idea. Right?
Yeah.
And
so your book goes into all of this. You've just given us a taste of it. And we don't want to get too much away, but we do want to encourage our folks to buy this book. And so we are out of time for today. And so we are offering Bill's brand new book. It's called Miraculous Milestones. 280 pages with 43 chapters in full color, is available for your contribution of $20, plus shipping and handling. So just go to our website, that's www.swpm.us, and go to our bookstore. Type in the subject, Miraculous Milestones, and the website again is www.swpm.us. Well, friends, thank you for joining us for today's podcast. I look forward to seeing you next time as we discuss with Bill Federer the current state of America. You will not want to miss this informative broadcast. Until then, this is your host, David Schnitker. Thanks for listening.